The wind up here doesn't just blow, it screams. It's a sonic assault that tears through Gore-Tex and fleece like they're made of wet tissue paper. My breath was freezing against the inside of my balaclava, creating a jagged crust of ice that scraped my lips with every inhalation. Check the elevation. 2,000 meters. The Italian Dolomites. A long way from the strip malls of Ohio or the backwoods of Montana, but the smell. The smell of the end of the world is exactly the same. It smells like copper, wood smoke, and rot. I'd been tracking the signal for 3 days. A repeating low-frequency burst on the emergency band. Not standard NATO, not local carabinieri. It was American. Specifically, it was a pattern delta distress beacon, the kind used by contractors deeply embedded in places they weren't supposed to be. The kind of signal that means the plan has failed. Initiate Protocol Black. I crested the ridge, my boots crunching on the hard-packed permafrost. And there it was. The Grand Hotel Alpenglow. Or at least, that's what the faded, bullet-riddled brass sign said, half buried in a snowdrift. It was a monolith of stone and timber, a relic of the old world's excess, perched on a precipice overlooking a valley choked with gray mist. In the before times, this place would have cost you $5,000 a night. Now, it was just another mausoleum. I dropped to a knee, instinct taking over. Scan. Assess. My rifle, a battered 416 Hong Kong dollars I'd scavenged from a dead German KSK operator outside Munich, felt heavy in my hands. The optics were frosted, but the iron sights were true. I swept the windows. Shattered glass. Torn curtains fluttering like surrender flags. No movement. But in this new world, stillness is a lie. Stillness is usually just the infected waiting for you to make a sound. I checked my gear. Plate carrier tight. 3 mags left. A half bottle of water. If there were supplies inside, I lived another week. If there were infected, I had enough rounds to make it expensive for them. If it was empty, I'd freeze to death in a 5-star suite. Options A and B were preferable. I moved down the slope, sticking to the tree line. The silence was heavy, oppressive. Usually, you hear the birds or the wind in the pines. Here, nothing. Just the crunch of my boots. I reached the perimeter wall. The wrought iron gates were twisted outward, metal rendered like taffy. Something big had smashed its way out, not in. That stopped me cold. The intel on the infected back in the States, the runners, the shamblers, they didn't bend iron. But Europe. Europe had been hit first. The strains here were different. Harder. I slipped through the gap in the gate. The courtyard was a graveyard of luxury cars. Porsches, Bentleys, a shattered Ferrari. All covered in a thin shroud of snow, looking like sleeping beasts. I kept my weapon raised, pieing the corner toward the main entrance. The revolving doors were gone, just a gaping maw leading into the dark. Protocol Black, I muttered to myself. The term had been whispered in the safe zones before they fell. A scorched earth directive. If a containment zone fails, you don't evacuate. You sanitize. You bury the truth. And looking at the scorch marks up the side of the hotel's stone facade, it looked like someone had tried to burn this place down from the inside out. I crossed the threshold. The transition from the blinding white of the snow to the gloom of the lobby messed with my vision. I blinked, letting my pupils dilate. The lobby was cavernous. A chandelier the size of a minivan lay crashed in the center of the room, crystals scattered across the marble floor like diamonds. Behind the reception desk, a shadow moved. I froze. Safety off. Sights up. Friendly? I rasped. My voice sounded foreign, rusty from days of silence. No answer. Just the soft drip 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 of melting snow somewhere in the ceiling. I advanced, rolling my steps heel to toe to silence the noise. I reached the desk and vaulted over. Nothing. Just a corpse. A man in a tuxedo, dried blood matting his silver hair to the mahogany. He was clutching a telephone receiver in a death grip, the cord severed. But it was what was on the desk that made my blood run cold. A binder. Thick, black, stamped with a silver eagle. U.S. Department of Defense. And below it the red stamp, classified Project Chimera Protocol Black. This wasn't a hotel. It was a front. A CIA safe house masquerading as a ski resort. A place for off-the-books interrogations or high-value asset storage. And right now, it was ground zero. I opened the binder. The first page was a manifest. Asterisk subject 001, transported from Wuhan via private charter. Arrival, 1,400 hours. Status, asymptomatic. Asterisk. My heart hammered against my ribs. They brought it here. They brought the patient zero of the European strain right here, to the top of the world, thinking the cold would contain it. Thinking they could study it. I heard a noise. Not the wind. A scrape. Leather on marble. It came from the grand staircase. I slowly peeked over the rim of the desk. At the top of the stairs, standing in the shadows of the mezzanine, was a figure. It was wearing a tattered tactical vest, similar to mine. But the way it stood, listed to the side, spine bent at an impossible angle. It turned its head. The face was gone. Just a mass of fungal growth and exposed bone, but the eyes were still there. Blue. Human. And terrified. It wasn't an infected. It was a transition. A soldier, mid-turn, fighting the parasite inside his own brain. He raised a sidearm. Not at me. At his own temple. Asterisk bang. Asterisk. The sound echoed like a cannon shot in the empty hall. The body tumbled down the stairs, landing with a wet thud at the bottom. I didn't flinch. You stop flinching after the first year. I moved to the body. Check the tags. Asterisk Sergeant Miller. U.S. Special Forces. Asterisk he'd been holding the line. But against what? I looked up the staircase. Darkness. But in that darkness I heard it. A chittering sound. Like insects, but wet. Thousands of them. I grabbed the black binder and shoved it into my dump pouch. If I was going to die here, I was going to die knowing why. I checked the hallway to the east wing. The sign said Spa and Wellness Center. But someone had spray-painted over it in red, "Do not open dead inside." Standard horror movie warning. Usually I ignore it. Today I respected it. I moved west, toward the executive suites. That's where the VIPs would be. That's where the answers were. The hallway was narrow, lined with expensive art that had been slashed to ribbons. The carpet was soggy, squelching under my boots. Every door I passed was a story. Room 101, door kicked in, blood splatter on the ceiling. Room 102, barricaded from the inside, silent. Room 103, the door was open a crack. I pushed it open with the barrel of my rifle. Inside, a tactical map was pinned to the wall. Red lines drawn all over northern Italy. But one line was thick, black, and circled the very resort I was standing in. Next to it, a handwritten note, asterisk. Extraction failed. They are evolving. The cold doesn't kill them. It makes them faster. Asterisk. Faster. Great. Outside, the wind howled again, but this time, it carried a sound that wasn't weather. A howl. A shriek. It was coming from the valley floor. The pack. They had found my scent. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was the bait. I looked at the window. The sun was dipping below the peaks. Night was coming. And in the Italian Alps, the night is when the real monsters come out to play. I racked the charging handle on my 416 Hong Kong dollars, ensuring a round was seated. "Welcome to the Grand Hotel," I whispered. "Checkout time is never." I moved deeper into the facility, the darkness swallowing me whole. The deeper I went, the more the architecture changed. The wood and stone gave way to brushed steel and concrete. The luxury resort was just the skin. Underneath was a fortress. A fortress that had become a prison. And I had just locked myself inside with the inmates. The silence in the Hotel Monte Rosa wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized, the kind of acoustic dead zone that usually precedes a detonation. I stood in the center of the atrium, my breath pluming in the stagnant, freezing air. The heating systems had been cut hard, likely remotely. And the ambient temperature inside was dropping fast to match the blizzard raging outside the reinforced polycarbonate windows. I checked the Sunto core on my wrist. Altitude 2,400 meters. Temperature minus 12 degrees Celsius and falling. Survival wasn't just about avoiding whoever had triggered the evacuation. It was about thermodynamics. If I didn't secure a heat source within 4 hours, hypothermia would degrade my cognitive functions long before a bullet did. I moved to the perimeter, keeping my weight on the balls of my feet to dampen the sound of my boots on the imported marble. Tactical assessment of the lobby, nightmare scenario. It was a fatal funnel, a goldfish bowl of luxury with a 300-degree exposure from the mezzanine balconies above. Anyone with a suppressed rifle and a thermal optic could paint the walls with me from the second floor. I needed to get off the X. I transitioned to the concierge desk, vaulting over the granite top rather than using the swing gate, minimizing my profile. Behind the desk, the reality of the abandonment began to sharpen. It wasn't panic, it was procedure. There were no scattered papers, no overturned chairs. The computer terminals had been physically destroyed, hard drives drilled through with what looked like a portable press. This was a sanitization team's work, I pulled my sidearm, a subcompact Glock 43 I'd hiked in with, hardly a combat loadout, and press-checked it. 6 rounds of hollow point, plus 1 in the chamber. Against a professional clean-up crew, I was effectively unarmed. I needed intel before I could formulate an egress plan. The storm outside was a double-edged sword. It masked my thermal signature and sound, but it also turned the mountain into a lethal obstacle course. I moved toward the back of the house, slipping through the door marked staff only. The transition from the opulence of the lobby to the brutalist concrete of the service corridors was jarring. The air here smelled of ozone and stale coffee. My objective was the security hub. In a facility like this, where billionaires played at being mountaineers, the surveillance would be military grade. I found the door at the end of a long utility hallway. It was a maglock system, currently disengaged due to the power failure. I sliced the pie in the doorway, weapon tight to my chest, scanning the room. Clear. Inside, the bank of monitors was dead, black monoliths reflecting my own silhouette. But the dedicated server rack in the corner had a single amber LED pulsing. Independent backup power. I approached the console. The keyboard was smashed, but the tower unit was intact. I didn't need to access the OS. I needed to see what they hadn't had time to shred. On the floor, near the shredder bin, was a burned bag that had been sealed but not incinerated. A sloppy mistake. Or a hurried one. I used my knife to slit the heavy vinyl. Inside were printouts of guest manifests, but the names were redacted, replaced with alphanumeric codes. Underneath the manifest was a thick binder with a red cover sheet. Protocol Black, Containment and Liquidation. I crouched, using a tactical light on the lowest setting to read. Protocol Black wasn't just an evacuation order. It was a containment strategy for a Class 4 intelligence breach. The document detailed the resort not as a hotel, but as a holding site for high-value assets during negotiation phases. The evacuation order had been triggered 18 hours ago. The secondary order, the one that made the hair on my neck stand up, was time-stamped for 2 hours from now. Asset sterilization via kinetic strike. They weren't sending a rescue team. They were going to level the building to bury the evidence. But the text at the bottom of the page froze me. Deployment, Apex 9 Unit. Rules of engagement, free fire. No witnesses. Apex 9. I knew them by reputation only. Private military contractors who operated in the gray zones where Geneva Conventions were treated as suggestions. If Apex was inbound, they weren't coming to bomb the place immediately. They were coming to sweep it first. They needed to confirm the assets were dead before they brought the mountain down. A sound cut through my reading. A low, rhythmic thrumming, barely audible over the wind outside. It wasn't the chop of a rotor. The storm was too heavy for flight ops. It was the high-pitched whine of electric motors. Snowmobiles. High-torque, stealth-drive sleds designed for insertion. I killed my light. I was in a concrete box with one exit. I had to move. I shoved the binder into my jacket, zipping it tight against my chest to add a layer of insulation. I exited the security room, moving fast now, trading silence for speed. I headed for the kitchen. Industrial kitchens are full of improvised weapons and, more importantly, chaotic geometry that disrupts sight lines. As I pushed through the swinging doors into the stainless steel expanse of the galley, I heard the breach. Glass shattering in the lobby, 2 floors above. The sound was distinct, breaching charges on the main doors. Controlled. Professional. I scanned the kitchen. Knives were useless against body armor. I needed a force multiplier. My eyes locked on the chemical storage cage near the dish pit. Ammonia. Bleach. High-concentration degreasers. It was crude, World War I tech, but in a confined ventilation system, chloramine gas is a denial-of-area weapon. I grabbed 2-gallon jugs of bleach and a canister of ammonia cleaner. I moved to the service elevator shaft. The doors were pried open a few inches. I wedged them further, looking down into the darkness of the sub-basement, and up toward the lobby levels. The sound of heavy boots on marble echoed down the shaft. They were moving in a stack, disciplined and heavy. Clear right. Moving. A voice distorted by a radio comms filtered down. I didn't have much time. I poured the bleach into a metal mop bucket, then set the ammonia bottle next to it, uncapped, precariously balanced on the edge of the bucket. I tied a length of paracord from the ammonia bottle to the handle of the service door. It was a simple tripwire mechanism. As soon as someone opened this door fully to sweep the room, the chemicals would mix. It wouldn't kill a man in MOPP gear, but Apex operators likely prioritized ballistic protection over full chem seals for a snatch and grab. At the very least, it would panic them, obscure their vision, and buy me seconds. I retreated to the far end of the kitchen, toward the walk-in freezers. The layout plans I'd glimpsed in the security room showed a service tunnel connecting the kitchen cold storage to the external waste management facility, about 200 meters down the slope. It was a rat hole, but it was my only way out of the kill box. The cold in the walk-in freezer was negligible compared to the dread pooling in my gut. I moved past hanging sides of beef that had frozen solid, effectively becoming cover. I reached the rear access hatch. It was rusted shut. I cursed silently, holstering my pistol to use both hands on the wheel valve. I strained, the metal groaning. From the kitchen behind me, I heard the service door kick open. Asterisk clatter. Splash. Asterisk. A hiss like a serpent, followed immediately by shouting. Gas! Gas! Contact front! Coughing. The sound of boots scrambling. I wrenched the wheel with everything I had. The seal broke with a sharp crack, and the hatch swung inward. A blast of icy wind hit me, carrying snow into the freezer. I didn't hesitate. I dove into the tunnel just as a burst of automatic fire chewed up the doorframe where I had been standing a second before. I was in the chute now. Sliding down a 40-degree incline of smooth concrete, plunging into the dark underbelly of the resort. I scrambled for purchase, boots skidding, until I leveled out in a drainage corridor. I was out of the main building, but I wasn't safe. I checked the Glock. I hadn't fired a shot, but my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump. I pulled the dossier out. Protocol Black. I opened the binder again in the dim light of the tunnel's emergency strips. My eyes caught a photo clipped to a profile. It was a photo of me. Beneath my face, the text read, Subject 82. Status rogue. Terminate on sight. I wasn't a witness who had stumbled onto a crime scene. I was the reason the resort had been evacuated. I was the reason Apex was here. The memories I didn't have. The gap in my timeline before I woke up on the trail. It wasn't amnesia from the altitude. It was a wipe. And it hadn't worked. The reverberation of the steel door slamming shut below me felt less like a sound and more like a pressure wave hitting my diaphragm. I was wedged into the crawl space above the false ceiling of the maintenance corridor. My body contorted around a bundle of insulated copper pipes that radiated a dull, biting cold. Dust motes danced in the single, razor-thin beam of light escaping from the vent slats beneath my face. I held my breath, counting the beats of my heart, forcing them to slow down. Panic burns oxygen. Oxygen is time. And in the dark of the Hotel Paradiso, time was the only currency I had left. From the hallway floor, 10 feet below, came the sound. It wasn't the chaotic scuttle of a wild animal, nor the heavy, rhythmic stomp of a security guard. It was the distinct, wet click of hard rubber soles on polished concrete, accompanied by the low-frequency hum of servomotors. A drone? No. The footfalls were bipedal. Uneven. Heavy. I pressed my eye to the grate. The angle was restrictive, cutting off everything above waist height, but what I saw froze the blood in my veins. Legs. Clad in matte black tactical polymers, articulated at the knees with external bracing. Whatever walked below me was wearing armor designed for ballistic impact, but the gait was wrong, it dragged the left leg slightly. A heavy thud scraped rhythm that echoed down the empty corridor. It paused directly under the vent. I watched a gloved hand come into view, holding a device that looked like a modified Geiger counter, but the display glowed a harsh, angry crimson rather than green. It was scanning for heat signatures. I slowly withdrew my hand from the warm copper pipe I was bracing against. The thermal contrast would be a beacon. I curled into a fetal position, pulling my thermoline parka tight over my head, praying the heavy wool and mylar lining would scatter my IR signature enough to blend with the ambient chill of the shaft. The device below chirped, a rising, inquisitive electronic trill. Then silence. For a full minute, the entity stood motionless. I could hear the faint whir of optical lenses focusing. Then, the thud scrape resumed, fading toward the elevator banks. I waited 5 minutes after the sound died before moving. My muscles screamed in protest as I army crawled toward the junction box for the West Wing. According to the faded schematics I'd photographed in the lobby, the West Wing housed the Executive Wellness Center, a euphemism that, given the protocol black documents I'd found in the basement, likely meant something far more sinister than a spa. I dropped down into a linen closet on the 3rd floor. The air here was stale, smelling of lavender and old bleach. My tactical light was set to its lowest lumen output, taped over with red film to preserve night vision and reduce the throw. I swept the room. Empty. I checked my gear, a climbing pick, a flare gun with 2 rounds, a jagged piece of rebar I'd sharpened on concrete, and the ruggedized tablet I'd pulled from the server room corpse. I sat on a stack of moth-eaten towels and booted the tablet. It was biolocked, but the screen cracked, bypassing the fingerprint scanner due to hardware failure. The OS was a proprietary Linux kernel. I accessed the root directory, my fingers trembling slightly from the adrenaline dump. File, *protocol_black_v4. Log star. I opened it. The text scrolled rapidly, fragmented corruptions marring the data, but the gist was legible and terrifying. Asterisk. Containment breach in Sector 4. Asset 9 Alpha non-responsive to verbal commands. Auditory cortex inhibitors failed. Authorized lethal force. Protocol Black initiated. Total facility sterilization. No witnesses. No survivors. Seal the mountain. Asterisk. The date on the log was 3 years ago. The entry stopped abruptly. Sterilization. I whispered, the word feeling like ash in my mouth. This wasn't an abandonment. It was a tomb. The resort was a cage for something they called assets, and Protocol Black was the gas that filled the chamber. A sudden noise from the hallway cut my reading short. Glass breaking. Not accidental, deliberate. The shattering of a window, followed by the crunch of boots on glass. They were searching room to room. I was being hunted. And based on the efficiency of the search pattern, there was more than one of them. I needed a choke point. The Executive Wellness Center had a reinforced access door, likely for VIP privacy. If I could fuse the locking mechanism, I could buy myself an hour to decipher the rest of the logs and find an exit route that didn't involve the main roads, which were undoubtedly watched. I moved into the corridor, keeping low, hugging the wall. The architecture of the hotel, once majestic, now felt predatory. The vaulted ceilings swallowed the light, and the marble statues in the alcoves looked like silent sentinels watching my demise. I reached the double doors of the wellness center. They were heavy oak reinforced with steel plating. Locked. I pulled the lockpick set from my pocket, inserting the tension wrench. My hands were cold, clumsy. Asterisk click. Asterisk. From the end of the hallway, 70 meters away, a floodlight blinded me. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a shoulder-mounted tactical lamp. Target acquired. A voice synthesized through a modulator barked. It sounded flat, devoid of human inflection. I didn't hesitate. I kicked the door, the lock cylinder snapping under the force, and threw myself inside just as the air where my head had been disintegrated. No gunshot sound. Just the crack of the supersonic projectile and the thwack of it embedding into the door frame. Suppressed high-velocity rounds. I slammed the door shut and jammed the sharpened rebar through the handles, wedging it against the heavy brass fittings. A second later, a heavy impact shuddered through the wood, but the bar held. I was in. But I was trapped. The wellness center was a labyrinth of treatment rooms tiled in obsidian and white ceramic. It looked less like a spa and more like an operating theater. In the center of the room was a drained pool, the tiles stained with something dark and dry. But it was the equipment lining the walls that drew my focus. These weren't massage tables. They were restraints. Heavy leather straps, steel buckles, and 4 drips hanging like weeping willows. I scanned the room for a secondary exit. Nothing but ventilation grates too small for a human. Asterisk thud. 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 Asterisk. The blows against the door were rhythmic, mechanical. They weren't trying to break it down. They were testing the structural integrity, calculating the weakest point. I backed away, my boots crunching on something on the floor. I looked down. Spent shell casings. And a skeleton. The remains were dressed in a lab coat. In the skeletal hand was a chaotic scrawl of writing on a clipboard. I shone my red light on it. Asterisk. They hunt by sound. They hunt by heart rate. The Black Protocol isn't just a kill order. It's a release order. We let them out to kill us. God forgive us, we let them out. Asterisk. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Asterisk. They hunt by heart rate. Asterisk. The scanner I saw earlier wasn't just thermal. It was biometric. They could hear my pulse through the walls if they were close enough. The bashing at the door stopped. Silence. Then, a high-pitched whine, like a dentist's drill, started from the door hinges. They were cutting through. I scanned the room frantically. The pool. The drain. It was a massive industrial intake, easily 2 feet wide. If I could pry the grate off, it might lead to the filtration systems in the sub-basement. It was a desperate, claustrophobic gamble, but the alternative was the thing cutting through the door. I jumped into the empty pool, sliding down the slick tiles. I jammed the tip of my climbing pick into the grate's rusted bolts. I torqued it with everything I had. The metal groaned, a sound too loud in the silent room. The drilling at the door stopped instantly. They heard it. I froze. The door exploded inward, wood splinters showering the room like shrapnel. Through the dust, a silhouette stepped in. It was 7 feet tall, clad in the black armor. Its helmet was a smooth, featureless dome of black glass. It turned its head slowly, scanning. It didn't see me. Not yet. I was below the sight line of the pool edge. But it would hear my heart. I could feel it pounding in my throat, a drum alerting the hunter. I pressed my hand over my chest, as if that could muffle the sound inside my own body. The figure took a step into the room. Then another. It was moving toward the pool. I looked at the grate. 1 bolt was loose. 3 to go. I had seconds. I gripped the pick, took a breath that tasted of copper and fear, and prepared to force the grate, or die trying. Protocol Black was in full effect, and I was the only glitch in the system. The silence of the Alps is a heavy thing, usually broken only by the wind howling through the granite peaks or the distant crack of settling glaciers. But inside the service corridors of the Hotel Paradiso, the silence was being dissected by a rhythmic, mechanical thudding that turned my blood into ice water. Heavy boots. Mil-spec treads on marble and concrete. They weren't hikers, and they certainly weren't local police. These were the cleanup crew I had dreaded since finding the dossier in the lobby. I pressed my back against the cold stainless steel of an industrial dishwasher, crouching in the shadows of the resort's cavernous kitchen. My breath was a traitor, rising in visible plumes in the freezing air, forcing me to breathe through the fabric of my scarf to disperse the heat. The thermal variance would be slight, but against professional-grade optics, slight was enough to get you killed. I checked my watch, 0200 hours. The blizzard outside was raging against the reinforced glass of the atrium, a white void that offered no escape. I was trapped in a gilded cage with predators who knew the layout better than I did. Vector 1 to base. Sector 4 clear. Moving to sub-level maintenance. A voice crackled. It was close, too close. The sound didn't come from a radio. It came from the hallway just beyond the swing doors. The voice was distorted, synthesized through a tactical throat mic. I gripped the heavy iron pry bar I'd scavenged from the janitorial closet. It was a crude weapon against suppressed carbines and Kevlar, but it was all I had. The protocol black documents I'd shoved into my jacket pocket felt heavy, like a lead weight pressing against my ribs. I needed to know more. The lobby files had been a preamble, a guest list of the world's elite, and a series of cryptic dates. But the real data. The operational logs that explained why the resort had been abandoned mid-dinner service 20 years ago, and why a paramilitary unit was sweeping it. Now, would be in the security director's office on the mezzanine. I moved. Not running, but rolling my weight from heel to toe to dampen the sound, a technique learned in a life I tried to forget. I slipped through the prep area, navigating a maze of hanging copper pots and rusted meat hooks that looked like medieval torture devices in the gloom. The kitchen opened into the service elevator bay. The indicator lights were dead, the power cut decades ago, but the shaft was still a vertical highway. I pried the doors open, the metal groaning in protest. I froze, waiting for a shout, a shot, anything. Silence returned, heavy and oppressive. Climbing the maintenance ladder inside the shaft was a nightmare of rusted rungs and vertigo. 3 floors up. My shoulders burned, and the pry bar clattered softly against my thigh with every step. I reached the mezzanine level and forced the doors. The hallway here was carpeted in rotting crimson velvet, muffling my footsteps as I sprinted low toward the double oak doors at the end of the corridor, Ufficios Sicurezza. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and ozone. The room was a fortress of analog tech, walls of CRT monitors, reel-to-reel tape decks, and a massive shredded paper bin that had been overturned. But the centerpiece was a heavy steel safe, the door slightly ajar. Someone had been here before the evacuation, someone in a hurry. I clicked on my low-lumen tactical light, keeping the beam shielded with my fingers. The desk was covered in maps of the mountain range, marked with red topographic circles. I swept the light over a ledger lying open on the leather blotter. The header stamped in red ink made my stomach drop. * protocol black. Containment failure day 0. *. I began to read, my eyes scanning the frantic handwriting of the last security director. This wasn't a viral outbreak, or a terrorist threat. It was something far more insidious. The resort wasn't just a hotel. It was a filtration system. The guests were subjects, hand-picked for genetic compatibility. Protocol Black wasn't about saving them. It was a sterilization order. The entry dated November 14, 1998, read, **. Subject 4 broke containment. The aggression levels are off the charts. It's not human anymore. Central Command has authorized the purge. We are sealing the exits. No one leaves. God forgive us. **. My heart hammered against my ribs. They didn't evacuate. They were sealed in. The missing guests, the untouched dinner plates, they were all still here, somewhere deep in the bowels of the mountain. And if the sweepers were here now, it meant either they were retrieving something, or something had woken up. A sharp click echoed from the doorway. Reflexes took over. I dropped behind the heavy oak desk just as the air above me snapped with the supersonic crack of a suppressed bullet. Wood splinters rained down on my head. Target acquired. Sector 2, Director's Office. Lethal authorization granted. The synthesized voice said, calm and professional. I didn't wait. I grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the desk and hurled it toward the corner of the room, shattering a glass cabinet. The mercenary's barrel swung toward the noise, a rookie mistake, or perhaps arrogance. In that split second I lunged. I didn't go for the gun. I went for the space between the helmet and the shoulder plate. I drove the pry bar down with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I possessed. The impact was sickening, a crunch of ceramic plating and bone. The mercenary crumpled, his rifle skittering across the floor. I didn't stop to check his vitals. I scrambled for the weapon, a compact SIG MCX with an integral suppressor and thermal optic. I checked the mag full. Unit 4 report. A voice barked in the earpiece of the fallen soldier. Unit 4, do you have eyes on? I ripped the comms unit off his vest and crushed it under my boot. Now they knew. The stealth phase was over. This was a hunt. I moved to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. Outside, through the swirling snow, I saw the impossible. The courtyard below, previously empty, was now lit by flares. In the center of the snow-buried pool, a section of the concrete was retracting, revealing a gaping maw leading underground. A massive ventilation fan slowly churned to life, blowing 20 years of stagnant air out into the storm. The smell hit me even through the glass. It wasn't just rot. It was a copper tang of blood and something chemically sweet, like formaldehyde. The sweepers weren't just cleaning up old files. They were opening the vault. I looked back at the dead mercenary. On his shoulder patch, barely visible in the gloom, was an insignia I didn't recognize, a black helix bisected by a lightning bolt. Underneath, a single word, ether. I grabbed the ledger and the rifle. The realization washed over me with the force of an avalanche. The subjects mentioned in the logs. If they had been sealed in for 20 years, adapted to the dark, fed on God knows what. Opening that vault wasn't just a recovery mission. It was a dinner bell. I had to get to the generator room in the basement. If I could cut the power to the hydraulic lifts, I could keep that vault closed. But that meant going down. Down past the sweepers, down into the dark where the original guests of the Hotel Paradiso were waiting. I checked the chamber of the rifle, took a steadying breath, and stepped out into the corridor. The luxury resort had become a kill house, and the walls were closing in. The service corridor smelled of ozone and ancient, settled dust. I pressed my back against the cold concrete, counting the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the steel grating overhead. My breath was a shallow ghost in the freezing air, visible even in the gloom of the emergency red lighting. I checked the magazine of the suppressed MP5 I'd scavenged from the body in the lobby. 12 rounds. Not enough for a firefight, only enough for a solution. I was deep in the bowels of the resort now, level B3, maintenance and HVAC. Above me, the blizzard was tearing the luxury suites apart, but down here, the silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the backup generators and the hunting party moving with disciplined precision. These weren't looters. The way they moved, slicing the corners, maintaining noise discipline, checking their 6, they were Tier 1 operators. Or what passed for them in the private sector. The patch on the dead man's shoulder had been a black circle with a single white line dissecting it. No nation, no name. Just an agenda. I needed to reach the central server node. The architect's blueprints I'd found in the manager's office indicated a localized hardened room behind the boiler arrays. That's where the data for Protocol Black would be housed. If I wanted to survive the night, I had to know what I had walked into. I wasn't a guest. I was a loose end. I moved. Low crouch, weight on the balls of my feet, rolling heel to toe to silence the impact. I slipped past a row of rusted pressure valves, the steam hissing like a nest of vipers. Ahead, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A sentry. He was facing away, scanning the intersection of the corridors with thermal optics. I could see the faint glow of the display reflected on his tactical goggles. He turned. I didn't hesitate. I surged forward, closing the 5-meter gap before his rifle could level. My left hand jammed the barrel of his carbine upward, the discharge shattering a fluorescent light fixture above us in a shower of sparks. I drove the combat knife into the gap between his plate carrier and his clavicle. He convulsed, a wet gasp escaping the balaclava, and slumped heavy against me. I lowered him silently, adrenaline spiking my heart rate into a painful hammer rhythm against my ribs. I dragged him into the alcove behind the pipes. I stripped his comms unit, jamming the earpiece into my own ear. Static, then a voice, calm and digitized. Team leader to Delta 3. Report status at Sector 4. I stayed silent. Delta 3 report. Post-check indicates elevated stress response. Delta 3? Break. The voice snapped. Asset neutralized or compromised in Sector 4. Initiate containment. Seal the bulkheads. Gas the vents. Gas. My eyes widened. They weren't just hunting, they were sanitizing. I scrambled away from the body, checking my own gear. I didn't have a mask. I had minutes, maybe seconds, before the ventilation system pumped something neurotoxic into the basement levels. I broke into a sprint, abandoning stealth. The echo of my boots rang out like gunshots, but it didn't matter anymore. The server room door was a heavy slab of reinforced steel, fitted with a biometric lock. I didn't have a finger, and I didn't have a code. I did, however, have the breaching charge I'd lifted from the sentry's belt. I slapped the putty against the hinges, shoved the detonator pin, and vaulted behind a stack of industrial pallets. The explosion sucked the air out of the corridor, a concussive slap that made my teeth ache. Smoke rolled thick and acrid. I was through the gap before the dust settled. Inside, the air was freezing, maintained at near zero for the server racks. Rows of blue LEDs blinked in the dark, a digital graveyard of secrets. I reached the terminal. It was still active. The screen displayed a single, pulsing prompt, *protocol black, upload complete. Purge pending. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I wasn't a master hacker, but the system was in emergency mode, the firewalls lowered for the data exfiltration. I bypassed the admin login and pulled up the root directory. What I saw made my blood run colder than the blizzard outside. It wasn't a resort. It was a conditioning facility. The manifests didn't list guests, they listed subjects. The amenities, the spa, the gourmet food, the controlled oxygen levels in the rooms, were delivery systems for experimental psychoactive compounds. They were rewriting memories. The wealthy elite came here to forget crimes, to erase trauma, or to have their personalities adjusted to be more ruthless, more compliant. Protocol Black wasn't an evacuation plan. It was the liquidation of the control group. Total site sterilization, I whispered, reading the scrolling text. Thermobaric structural collapse initiated. They were going to blow the mountain. They were going to bury the evidence under 1 million tons of rock and ice. A red light began to stroke in the corner of the room. The terminal locked up. Access denied. Intruder alert. The heavy thud of footsteps vibrated through the floor. Not the stealthy prowl of the scouts, but the rhythmic, heavy stomp of heavy infantry. I spun around, raising the MP5. The smoke at the doorway swirled. A figure stepped through, massive, clad in heavy ballistic armor that looked more like a bomb suit than tactical gear. He carried a rotary grenade launcher slung low on his hip. "You're thorough," the voice boomed, amplified by a helmet speaker. "Most urban explorers die in the minefields. You made it to the brain. Who are you?" I yelled, putting the server rack between us. "We are the janitors," the heavy said. He raised the launcher. "And you are the mess." He fired. I dove. The grenade impacted the server bank I'd been standing behind. The explosion shredded the electronics, sending shrapnel and sparks spraying like confetti. The shockwave threw me against the far wall. My vision blurred, a high-pitched whine drowning out the world. I scrambled on hands and knees, glass shards digging into my palms. I saw a grate in the floor, drainage. I didn't think, I acted. I kicked the rusted iron mesh. It held. I kicked again, screaming with the effort, feeling the bone in my heel bruise. The heavy was reloading, the metallic clack-clack-clack of the cylinder turning sound impossibly loud. The grate gave way. I squeezed through the opening just as the second grenade turned the room above me into an inferno. I fell, tumbling down a slick, slimy chute, hitting water hard. I surfaced, gasping in darkness. The water was freezing, rushing fast. A subterranean runoff channel. I was alive, but I was being swept deeper into the mountain, away from the exit, and the timer on the structural collapse was ticking down. Above me, the mountain groaned, a deep geological rumble that signaled the beginning of the end. I grabbed a rusted rebar ladder embedded in the concrete wall of the tunnel, the current tearing at my legs. I hauled myself up to a narrow ledge, shivering violently, hypothermia clawing at my mind. I checked the datapad I'd managed to keep gripped in my hand. The screen was cracked but legible. It showed a map of the facility's structural weak points where the explosives were planted. One of the charges was directly below the main gondola station, the only way off the mountain. If they blew that, I was entombed. If I could disarm it, I might have a chance. But I had to get back up. I had to go through the heavy, through the gas, and through the best killers money could buy. I racked the slide on the MP5. The water dripping from my clothes sounded like a ticking clock. Protocol Black was designed to erase everything. I decided then and there, I wasn't going to be erased. I was going to be the glitch that burned the system down. My breath plumed before me, a traitorous fog in the sub-zero stagnation of the meat locker, and I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing the air back down. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic rhythm that felt loud enough to echo off the stainless steel shelving. Through the heavy, insulated door, the muffled thud of combat boots on the kitchen tile grew louder. They weren't walking, they were sweeping. The cadence was professional, short, controlled steps, pause, pivot. These weren't looters looking for silverware. This was a kill team. I checked the Glock 17 I'd scavenged from the dead security guard in the lobby 3 hours ago. 7 rounds left. 1 in the chamber. No spare mag. Against a squad equipped with thermal optics and suppressed carbines, I was effectively unarmed. I needed an equalizer, and I needed it 5 minutes ago. My eyes darted around the freezer. Hanging sides of beef, frozen solid, acted as grim monoliths of cover. On the shelf next to me, a rusted industrial meat hook and a heavy canister of liquid nitrogen used for flash-freezing gourmet desserts. A desperate plan began to coalesce in the adrenaline-soaked haze of my mind. The handle of the freezer door turned. It groaned, a metallic shriek that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The seal broke with a hiss of pressure equalization. I didn't wait. I kicked the canister of liquid nitrogen over, the heavy cylinder clanging against the floor, and simultaneously scrambled back behind a hanging carcass. The valve sheared off on impact. A violent hiss erupted as the gas expanded instantly, filling the entryway with a blinding, freezing white fog. The first operative stepped in, a silhouette backlit by the kitchen lights. He wore matte black tactical gear, no insignia, his face obscured by a ballistic mandible mask and quad-lens night vision goggles. The expanding gas hit him, dropping the ambient temperature to nearly 300 degrees below zero in seconds. He staggered, his optics likely whiting out from the thermal inversion. I lunged. I swung the meat hook with every ounce of hysterical strength I possessed. The steel tip caught the strap of his rifle, jerking him forward into the freezing cloud. I didn't stick around to finish the fight. As he flailed, his weapon discharging blindly into the ceiling. Asterisk thwip, thwip, thwip asterisk. I sprinted past him, diving through the open door and rolling across the kitchen floor. Contact rear! Freezer! A digitized voice barked over a localized comms net. I could hear it emanating from the downed man's earpiece. I scrambled up and bolted toward the service dumbwaiter. The resort's layout was a labyrinth of luxury overlaying a skeleton of industrial utility. The guests saw marble and mahogany. The staff saw concrete and steel. I needed the skeleton. I jammed the call button, but the lights were dead. Power cut. Of course. Sector 4, flush him out. Lethal authorization granted. Protocol Black is active. No witnesses. A voice echoed from the hallway. I abandoned the dumbwaiter and kicked open the door to the laundry chute. It was a tight squeeze, a sheer metal slide plunging into darkness. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself in feet first, sliding down 3 stories in a terrifying rush of stale air and claustrophobia. I landed hard in a pile of linens in the basement laundry facility, the impact jarring my teeth. I rolled off the pile, weapon raised. The basement was dimly lit by emergency red floods, casting long, bloody shadows across the industrial washers. It was quiet down here, but the vibration of heavy machinery hummed through the floor. The generator. They were keeping the critical systems online. Why? If this was a liquidation, why keep the power on? I moved toward the maintenance office, keeping low, slicing the pie around every corner. The tactical discipline was coming back to me, muscle memory from a life I thought I'd left behind. Step, scan, breathe. Step, scan, breathe. The door to the maintenance office was ajar. Inside, a bank of monitors flickered. Most showed static, but one was cycling through security feeds. I watched, mesmerized and horrified. On the screen, the lobby, the place where I'd found the half-eaten meals, was now a staging ground. The black-clad operatives were setting up tripods with strange, hexagonal emitters. They weren't explosives. They looked like directed energy arrays, or perhaps high-output sonic devices. In the center of the room, they had piled the debris. My stomach turned. It wasn't debris. It was the personal effects of the guests. Phones, laptops, wallets. They were stripping the identities of the victims before. Before what? I shifted my attention to the desk. A ruggedized laptop sat open, a progress bar inching across the screen. Data purge, 88% complete. Next to it lay a thick binder, the cover stamped with a crimson triangle and the words, Operation Ethelmere, Protocol Black. I holstered the Glock and flipped the binder open. My hands shook, the pages crinkling under my fingers. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't a terrorist attack. The text was dense with medical jargon and physics equations, but the summary on page 4 hit me like a physical blow. Asterisk. Subject: neurological entrainment and mass suggestion via infrasonic resonance. Site: Hotel Veta. Objective: test efficacy of the siren waveform on high-net-worth targets in a controlled, isolated environment. Result: catastrophic success. Subjects exhibited total loss of cognitive autonomy followed by violent psychosis. Containment breached. Protocol Black initiated. Total site sanitization. Asset liquidation. Structure demolition via controlled avalanche. Asterisk. They weren't evacuating the resort. The resort was the weapon. The guests were the lab rats. And Protocol Black wasn't a rescue mission. It was a cleanup crew sent to bury the evidence under 10 million tons of snow. Demolition via controlled avalanche. I whispered, the words tasting like ash. I looked at the time-stamp on the monitor. The avalanche charges were rigged to the seismic sensors on the ridge line. The countdown on the laptop wasn't just for the data purge. It was synchronized with the detonation timer. Asterisk T-18 minutes. Asterisk. I grabbed the binder, stuffing it into my jacket. I needed to get to the comms tower on the roof. It was the only place with a hardline connection that might not be jammed, or at least a vantage point to signal. Someone. Anyone. A heavy boot crunched on broken glass behind me. I spun, raising the Glock. Standing in the doorway was a figure that dwarfed the operatives upstairs. He wore heavier armor, a ballistic collar rising to his ears, and held a customized Scar-H battle rifle leveled at my chest. He didn't fire. He just tilted his head, the red light of the emergency floods reflecting off his visor like demon eyes. "You're the anomaly," he said, his voice mechanically distorted. "The one who wasn't on the guest list. The hiker who stumbled into the cage. And you're the janitor." I spat back, tightening my grip on the trigger. "We prefer auditors," he replied calmly. "And your audit is overdue." He moved with a speed that defied his bulk. I fired twice. Asterisk crack crack asterisk, the round sparking off his ceramic chest plate. He didn't flinch. He closed the distance in 2 strides, batting the gun from my hand with the barrel of his rifle. A backhand strike sent me reeling into the metal shelving unit, pain exploding behind my eyes. I slumped to the floor, vision swimming. The auditor stepped over me, leveling the muzzle of his rifle at my forehead. "Protocol Black is absolute," he stated, his finger tightening on the trigger. My hand brushed against something on the floor. A high-pressure pneumatic hose connected to the maintenance compressor. A tool for clearing debris. I grabbed the nozzle. "Wait!" I rasped, coughing blood. "The frequency. The siren waveform. It didn't work on everyone, did it?" He paused, just for a microsecond. Curiosity is a fatal flaw. So is standing on a wet floor next to a 240-volt conduit. I snarled. I jammed the air nozzle into the pool of water leaking from the washing machine behind him and yanked the release lever on the compressor. The blast of high-pressure air turned the water into a conductive mist, spraying directly into the exposed wiring of the junction box on the wall. A massive arc of blue-white electricity exploded outward. It caught the auditor, conducting through the water on the floor and his damp armor. He seized up, his muscles locking in a titanic contraction, the rifle firing a burst into the ceiling. I scrambled away on hands and knees as the room filled with the smell of ozone and burning insulation. The lights died completely, plunging us into total darkness. I fumbled for my gun, fingers scraping over the cold concrete. Found it. I didn't wait to see if he was dead. I ran. I ran blindly through the dark basement, guided only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of the charges being primed on the mountain above. 18 minutes. I had 18 minutes to climb 30 stories, bypass a death squad, and find a way off a mountain that was about to fall on top of me. I burst into the stairwell, lungs burning. The mystery was solved, but the nightmare was just entering its final act. As I began to climb, the building groaned, a deep, subsonic vibration that rattled my teeth. It wasn't the explosion. It was the siren. They had turned the machine back on. My breath was a traitor, a rhythmic plume of white vapor that threatened to betray my position with every exhalation. I pressed a gloved hand firmly over my mouth, forcing the air through the thick fabric to disperse the heat signature. Beneath the shattered remnants of the grand hall's marble staircase, the shadows were absolute. But against the military-grade thermal optics of the cleanup crew, shadows were irrelevant. Only temperature mattered. The floor was freezing, leaching the warmth from my belly where I lay prone in the dust, but right now, that hypothermic embrace was the only thing keeping me invisible. 3 of them. I could hear the crunch of tactical boots on the frosted debris. They moved with the synchronized fluidity of Tier 1 operators, likely private military contractors hired by Ethelgard, the shadowy holding company that technically owned this graveyard. They weren't police. Police shout warnings. These men swept their suppressors across the atrium in silence, communicating with subtle hand signals and encrypted burst transmissions. They were cleaners, and I was the last stain on the carpet. I checked the magazine of the Sig Sauer P226 I'd scavenged from the dead security chief in the wine cellar 2 hours ago. 7 rounds. 7 rounds of 9mm against ceramic body armor, ballistic helmets, and thermal imaging. A direct engagement was suicide. I had to force them into a fatal funnel, a choke point where their technological superiority would be nullified by environmental chaos. The point man stopped 10 feet from my hiding spot. Through a jagged gap in the rubble, I saw the dull green glow of his quadnods, night vision, reflecting off the polished ruins. He scanned the mezzanine, his rifle, a suppressed 416 Hong Kong dollars, panning smoothly. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat I prayed his audio pickups couldn't detect. He tapped his headset. Sector 4 clear. Moving to sublevel access. Bio readings are negative. Copy. A voice crackled in his earpiece, loud enough for me to hear in the stillness. Protocol Black is active. Timeline is T-30 minutes. Plant the charges and evac. Leave nothing biological intact. Protocol Black. The term had haunted the fragmented logs I'd found in the medical wing, but hearing it spoken aloud shifted the dynamic from a hunt to an execution. They weren't just here to kill witnesses. They were here to scorch the earth. T-30 meant demolition. Thermobaric, likely, to burn out whatever pathogen or experiment had gone wrong here. They moved past me, heading toward the heavy oak doors of the administration wing. I waited a strict 10 count, then rolled out from the staircase. My limbs were stiff, joints popping softly. I needed to get to the security server room before they blew the foundation. If I was going to die here, I needed to know why. I trailed them, keeping a 30-meter gap, stepping in their footprints to mask the sound. The resort, once a playground for the ultra-wealthy, was now a labyrinth of ice and rot. I stepped over the frozen corpse of a guest, a woman in a torn evening gown, her face twisted in a rictus of agony. Veins beneath her skin black and bulbous. Whatever killed her wasn't a bullet. It was internal, a systemic failure that looked like her blood had boiled. The squad breached the administration doors. I utilized the noise of their entry, the crunch of a door hinge, to sprint across the open expanse of the lounge and slide behind the concierge desk. I needed a distraction. I pulled a road flare from my pack, a leftover from my initial ascent up the mountain. It was primitive, but thermal optics had a fatal weakness. Sudden, intense heat blooms caused washout, blinding the sensors temporarily. I struck the cap. The flare hissed, sputtering brilliant red light and choking smoke. I hurled it over the desk toward the hallway entrance. "Contact front! Thermal bloom!" one of them shouted. As the red light washed out the corridor, blinding their night vision, I flanked right. Vaulting the counter and sprinting for the service elevator shaft. The doors were pried open. I grabbed the greasy cables and slid down into the darkness of the basement levels, the friction burning through my gloves. Above me, suppressed shots thwipped into the elevator shaft, sparks showering down like metallic rain. I hit the top of the elevator car 2 floors down with a bone-jarring thud. I rolled, absorbed the impact, and dropped through the maintenance hatch. The basement air was thick with the smell of copper and ozone. The generator room. But past that was the server farm. I moved through the darkness, relying on memory and the faint LED strobes of failing backup power. The cleaners would be cautious now. They knew they had a live hostile. I reached the server room, a glass-walled cube humming with dying fans. I shattered the lock with the butt of the cig and slipped inside. The main terminal was locked down, displaying a crimson warning, * contaminant breach. Lockdown level 5. * I fished the administrator keycard I'd taken from the frozen body of Dr. Vane in the cryolab back in Chapter 4. The reader beeped. Access granted? I didn't have time to download terabytes. I needed the executive summary. I navigated to the directory labeled Project, Ambrosia/Protocol Black. The text scrolled across the screen, illuminating my face in a ghostly blue. The horror of it settled in my gut, heavier than the cold. Subject: The Vale Resort / Field Test Site 4. Objective: Controlled release of viral strain Chimera 7 on high-net-worth individuals to test efficacy of experimental longevity therapeutics in high stress. Closed system environments. I stopped breathing. The resort wasn't a victim of an outbreak. It was a petri dish. The guests, billionaires, politicians, celebrities, they weren't customers. They were lab rats. They paid millions for exclusive retreats, unknowingly signing up to be injected with a biological agent designed to rewrite their DNA for extended life. Asterisk. Result: catastrophic failure. Strain Chimera 7 induces hyperaggression, necrosis, and eventual cognitive collapse. Subjects revert to predatory instincts within 48 hours. Asterisk. That explained the bodies upstairs. The claw marks on the walls. The guests hadn't just died, they had turned on each other. The resort had become a cage fight for the infected elite. Asterisk. Protocol Black initiation. Containment failed. Sanctioned solution. Total structural incineration via sublevel thermobaric saturation. No survivors permitted. Narrative cover. Avalanche and gas main explosion. Asterisk. A loud metallic clank echoed from the ventilation duct directly above me. I spun around, raising the cig. A small, spherical object dropped from the vent, bouncing once on the linoleum. A flashbang. I dove behind the server racks just as the world turned white. The concussion wave slapped me, stealing my hearing, replacing it with a high-pitched tinnitus scream. My vision swam, fractured and blurry. I was disoriented, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Boots hit the floor. The cleaners were in the room. My vision blurred, stabilizing slowly. I could see their silhouettes moving through the server aisles. They weren't rushing. They were sweeping, methodical, checking corners. I was trapped in a dead end, blinded, deafened, with 7 bullets and a knife. I looked at the terminal screen, still flickering. Asterisk. Override safety protocols? Asterisk. It blinked. An idea, desperate and suicidal, formed in the haze of my concussion. The server room was cooled by a halon gas suppression system, designed to suck the oxygen out of the room to kill electrical fires instantly. It was lethal to humans without independent air supply. The cleaners had gas masks attached to their helmets. I did not. But the turbulence of the gas discharge might disrupt their sensors, and the sheer noise would cover my movement. It was a gamble. Asphyxiation versus execution. I reached up, my hand trembling, and smashed the emergency fire suppression button on the wall. Sirens wailed, cutting through the ringing in my ears. Asterisk. Warning. Halon discharge imminent. Evacuate. Asterisk. The cleaners hesitated, looking up. In that second of confusion, I didn't run for the door. I ran at them. The gas jets exploded overhead with the sound of a jet engine taking off, blasting white chemical fog into the room. Visibility dropped to 0. The air became unbreathable instantly. I held my breath, my lungs burning, and tackled the nearest silhouette. We hit the floor. He was heavy, armored, but surprised. I didn't try to shoot, the vest would catch it. I jammed the barrel of the cig under his chin, into the soft armor gap of the neck gaiter, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred my arm. He went limp. I ripped the gas mask off his helmet, the straps tearing, and jammed it over my own face, inhaling a ragged, desperate gasp of filtered air. Man down! Man down! Contact is in the gas! The radio chatter screamed in the dead man's earpiece. I grabbed his 416 Hong Kong dollars rifle, checked the chamber, and rolled into the cover of the dense white fog. The thermal optics on the remaining two operators were struggling with the rapid temperature change of the pressurized gas expanding. They were firing blind, sprays of bullets shredding the servers, sparks showering like fireworks in the mist. I had their comms. I had their air. I had their weapon. "This is command." A voice boomed in my stolen ear. "Charges set in Sector 1, 2, and 3. Detonation in T-10 minutes. Get clear. Anyone left inside is collateral. 10 minutes. The resort was a bomb, and I was sitting on the detonator. I checked the rifle's optic. The battery was dead, but the iron sights were true. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the hazard. I stood up in the swirling chemical fog. My heart rate monitor, visible on the watch I wore, read 160 beats per minute. High but steady. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, mathematical clarity. I had 10 minutes to traverse 3 floors, bypass a kill team that knew I was coming, and escape a mountain that was about to be turned into a crater. I stepped over the body of the man I'd killed, retrieving 2 spare magazines from his vest. The weight of the rifle felt good, balanced, lethal. Through the white haze, I saw the flashlight beams of the remaining 2 operators cutting through the gloom, searching, sweeping. They were nervous now. Their movements were jerky. They knew they were locked in a room with something that refused to die. I keyed the radio on the dead man's chest rig, pressing the transmit button. "Command," I whispered, my voice distorted by the stolen mask. "This is Asset 44. I'm canceling the contract." I released the button, raised the rifle, and squeezed the trigger. The condensation on the brass pipes was the only thing moving in the geothermal sublevel, crying slow, oily tears onto the cracked concrete. I held my breath, pressing my back against the rusted housing of a turbine that had been silent for a decade. Above me, the luxury resort was a tomb of velvet and marble. Down here, it was the gut of the beast, smelling of sulfur and stale electricity. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash. I checked the magazine of the Sig Sauer P226 I'd liberated from the cleaner in the kitchen. 4 rounds. 4 rounds to fight a paramilitary kill squad sweeping the basement. The acoustics of the utility tunnels were a nightmare. Every drip sounded like a footstep. Every settling pipe sounded like a slide racking. I needed to move. The map I'd glimpsed in the security office indicated that the server farm for the resort's private network, the black heart of this place, was behind a reinforced door in Sector 4. That was Protocol Black. Whatever was on those drives was the reason a team of mercenaries was currently turning the Italian Alps into a war zone. It wasn't just money laundering. You don't deploy a wet work team with thermal optics for tax evasion. I heard them before I saw them. 2 distinct sets of footsteps, heavy, rhythmic. Rubber soles on wet concrete. They were moving in a bounding Overwatch pattern. Standard operating procedure for clearing a corridor. I couldn't shoot my way out. I had to be the ghost they were afraid of. I holstered the pistol and unclipped the utility knife I'd taken from the maintenance shed. The leading mercenary rounded the corner, his weapon light slicing through the steam. He was sweeping high. I was low. I surged up from behind the turbine, driving the blade into the gap between his tactical vest and his neck protection. He didn't scream, just a wet, gurgling gasp. I guided him down, stripping his earpiece before his knees hit the floor. Echo 2 report. A voice crackled in my ear. Russian accent, clipped, professional. I didn't answer. I dragged the body into the shadows and checked his rig. Flash bangs, a suppressor, and a keycard with a magnetic strip that looked like it cost more than my car. I took it all. I moved deeper into the tunnels, moving towards the hum of heavy electronics. The air grew warmer, drier. The smell of sulfur faded, replaced by the sterile scent of ozone. I reached a heavy steel door marked simply, Il Sanctuario. The sanctuary? I swiped the blood-smeared keycard. The light cycled from red to green with a heavy pneumatic hiss. Inside, the contrast was jarring. The rot of the resort didn't exist here. Rows of server racks hummed with blue LEDs, powered by a dedicated geothermal tap. In the center of the room sat a single terminal. I sat down, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The system was air-gapped, completely isolated from the outside world. I plugged in the decryption dongle I'd found in the manager's safe back in Chapter 4. The screen flickered. Protocol black, status active. I opened the directory. It wasn't just client names. It was dossiers. High-ranking EU officials, arms dealers, energy tycoons. But the files weren't banking records. They were biological profiles. DNA sequences. Blood types. Organ compatibility. My stomach turned over. The resort wasn't a vacation spot. It was a harvest farm. A high-end organ bank for the global elite, hidden under the guise of holistic wellness. Protocol Black wasn't the operation itself, it was the liquidation strategy. I clicked the final folder. A video file titled liquidation_ETH. I played it. A man in a suit, face blurred, spoke calmly. The site is compromised. The donor list is vulnerable. Initiate Protocol Black. Sanitize the facility. No witnesses. No survivors. Burn the structure to the bedrock. The timestamp was from 3 hours ago. The mercenaries weren't just here to kill me. They were here to rig the place to blow. They were erasing history. Suddenly, the radio in my ear crackled again. Viper actual to all units. Charges are set on the support pillars in sectors 1 through 5. Timer is live. We extract in 10 mics. Anyone left inside is ash. 10 minutes. I grabbed a portable hard drive from the desk and initiated the transfer. The progress bar crawled. 10%. 20%. Come on, I hissed, watching the door. The sound of boots echoed outside. Not stealthy this time. They were retreating, moving fast to the exfil point. I had a choice, run now and survive, or wait for the evidence that could burn this entire network to the ground. If I left without the drive, nobody would believe me. I'd be just another missing person in the Alps. 50%. A laser dot danced across the server rack next to my head. I threw myself to the floor as a burst of automatic fire shattered the monitors above me. Glass rained down. They hadn't cleared the room. They were just suppressing it before falling back. I scrambled behind the heavy rack, pistol drawn. "One bandit in the server room!" a voice shouted. "Frag out!" I saw the canister bounce off the doorframe. I didn't think. I kicked the heavy server tower, toppling it over to create a barricade just as the grenade detonated. The concussion hit me like a physical blow, sucking the air out of my lungs and ringing my ears until the world was nothing but a high-pitched whine. I coughed, tasting dust and blood. The drive. I reached up blindly, my fingers closing around the warm plastic of the hard drive still plugged into the shattered terminal. The light on it was solid blue. Transfer complete. I ripped it out and checked my watch. 7 minutes until detonation. The door to the server room was a twisted ruin. I pieced the corner, weapon raised. The corridor was empty, filled with the smoke of the grenade. The mercenaries were gone, heading for the surface. I couldn't go up the way I came. The main elevators would be death traps, and the stairs would be rigged. I needed another way out. I remembered the schematics, the geothermal vent. The steam release tunnels. They vented out to the side of the mountain, a mile below the resort's main face. It was a suicide run. The heat alone could kill me, and if the pressure valves were closed, I'd be boiled alive. But staying here meant being buried under 1,000,000 tons of luxury concrete. I sprinted out of the server room, the hard drive shoved into my jacket pocket against my heart. I bypassed the stairs and headed for the heavy maintenance hatch labeled exhaust. The wheel was hot to the touch. I used my sleeves to grip it, groaning with exertion as I fought the rust. It shrieked, turning inch by inch. Viper actual. 5 minutes to mark. The hatch gave way, swinging open with a blast of hot, moist air. The tunnel ahead was dark, narrow, and steep. A metal slide into the abyss. I could hear the roar of the geothermal pressure building up below. I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the vent. The heat was suffocating immediately. I lay on my back, arms crossed over my chest, and let gravity take me. I slid into the darkness, picking up speed, the metal seams tearing at my clothes. Down, down, away from the ticking clock above, and into the mountain's throat. The resort was about to die. I just hoped I wouldn't die with it. The service tunnels beneath the Grand Hotel Veta smelled of rusted iron, stagnant water, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. I pressed my back against the cold concrete of a structural pillar, my breath hitching in my throat. Above me, the heavy thud of tactical boots echoed through the ventilation shafts. The cleaners were efficient. They moved with a synchronized lethality that betrayed military training, likely private contractors scrubbing a black site operation gone wrong. My shoulder throbbed where the ceramic shard had sliced me earlier, a dull, rhythmic reminder that my time was running out. I checked the magazine of the Sig Sauer P226 I'd scavenged from the dead guard in the atrium. 7 rounds. 7 rounds against a kill team of at least 6 operators equipped with thermal imaging and suppressed carbines. I needed to level the playing field. The basement was a labyrinth of steam pipes and high-voltage junction boxes. The resort's mechanical heart that had kept beating long after the guests had vanished. I crawled toward the boiler room, the heat rising as I approached the massive, antiquated furnaces. If they were using thermals, the ambient heat here would flare their optics, turning me into a ghost in the static. I reached the main valve of the pressure release system. It was rusted tight. Gritting my teeth, I wedged the barrel of the pistol into the wheel's spoke for leverage and heaved. Metal screamed against metal. A jet of superheated steam hissed into the corridor, creating a blinding white wall of vapor. Contact rear. Steam venting. Shifting to sonar. A voice crackled over the radio I'd clipped to my belt. They were adapting. I didn't wait. I slipped through the maintenance hatch into the crawlspace that ran beneath the main laboratory wing, the area labeled prohibited on the blueprints. I'd found in the manager's office. This was where the luxury ended and the nightmare began. The crawlspace was tight, lined with asbestos-wrapped pipes and thick bundles of fiber-optic cables. I dragged myself forward, dust coating my sweating face, until I reached a grate looking down into what had been the wine cellar. Except it wasn't a wine cellar. It was a command center. Through the grate, I saw banks of servers humming with auxiliary power, the indicator lights blinking a frantic red. In the center of the room, a man in a pristine white hazmat suit was typing furiously at a terminal, flanked by 2 armed guards. The screens displayed biometric readouts, global maps, and a file header that made my blood run cold. Protocol Black, asset liquidation. I carefully unlatched the grate. It swung down silently, suspended by a single rusted hinge I had dampened with oil from a leaking pipe. I dropped. The impact was harder than I anticipated, my boots slamming onto the linoleum. The guards spun around, weapons raising, but the element of surprise was the only currency I had left. I fired twice. The first round took the guard on the left in the throat, the suppressor on the scavenged pistol coughing a dull thwip. He dropped without a sound. The second guard was faster. He dove behind a server rack, his rifle spraying a burst of wildfire that shattered the monitors above my head. Glass rained down. I rolled forward, sliding across the polished floor, and fired blindly around the rack. A grunt, then the heavy clatter of a rifle hitting the ground. Silence returned, punctuated only by the humming of the servers and the ragged breathing of the scientist. I leveled my weapon at the man in the hazmat suit. "Step away from the console." He turned slowly, raising his gloved hands. Behind the visor, his eyes were wide, not with fear of me, but with a terrifying resignation. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice muffled. "The sequence is already locked. You can't stop the purge." "What is Protocol Black?" I demanded, advancing on him. "What were you doing to the guests?" The scientist laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The guests? They weren't guests. They were incubators." The Veta wasn't a resort. It was a filtration system for the cognitive dissonance algorithm we developed during the Cold War. We were mapping the neural pathways of the elite, rewriting their loyalties. But the pathogen evolved. It went from digital to biological. That's why the resort closed. That's why we're here. He pointed to the screen. A countdown timer was ticking down from 12 minutes. "Protocol Black isn't just a cleanup," he whispered. It's a sterilization event. The charges are set on the geothermal vents beneath the foundation. When that timer hits 0, this entire mountain comes down. The avalanche will bury the hotel, the evidence, and us under 3 million tons of snow and rock. I stared at the timer. 11:43. Cancel it, I ordered. I can't. It's hardwired. Once initiated, the only way to stop it is a manual override at the transmission tower on the peak. But you'll never make it. My team is already collapsing the perimeter. I pistol-whipped him, knocking him unconscious. I didn't have time for moral debates or interrogations. I grabbed the hard drive protruding from the main terminal, the evidence of their atrocities, and shoved it into my jacket. I needed to move. The boiler room fight had bought me minutes, but the gunshot noise in the server room would draw the rest of the pack. I sprinted out of the server room, checking the blueprint in my mind. The transmission tower was accessible via the roof of the north wing, but the elevators were dead. I had to take the stairs, 10 floors up, through a kill box of trained mercenaries, with a mountain about to explode beneath my feet. I burst into the stairwell, my legs burning. Floor 1. Floor 2. I could hear shouting above me. They were sweeping down. I stopped at the landing of the 3rd floor and kicked open the door to the guest hallway. It was a long, opulent corridor lined with velvet wallpaper that was peeling like dead skin. At the far end, a tactical light cut through the gloom. Target spotted 3rd floor hallway. I dove into the nearest room, Suite 304. Just as bullets chewed up the door frame. I scrambled across the dusty carpet, overturning a heavy oak dresser to create a barricade. The room had a balcony. I rushed to the glass doors and shattered them with the butt of my gun. The icy wind of the Alps hit me like a physical blow, roaring and biting at my exposed skin. The snowstorm was a whiteout, visibility near 0. I looked up. The north wing roof was 2 floors above and 20 feet to the right. A sheer, icy ledge ran along the exterior facade connecting the balconies. It was suicide. But the hallway door was splintering under the assault of a battering ram. I climbed over the railing. The wind threatened to tear me from the building, and the drop was 1,000 feet into a black abyss. My fingers numb, I clung to the frozen masonry. Below me, I could hear the dull thud of explosions, breaching charges. They were coming into the room. I began to shimmy across the ledge, the stones slick with ice. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest. A spotlight from a helicopter flared in the distance, sweeping the mountainside. They had air support. Of course they did. I reached the drain pipe that ran up to the roof. It was rusted, vibrating in the wind. I tested it with my weight. It groaned but held. I started to climb, hand over hand, the pistol heavy in my pocket, the hard drive digging into my ribs. As I crested the roofline, I saw the transmission tower looming in the blizzard, a skeletal spire of metal. But standing between me and the manual override box was a figure clad in black tactical gear, holding a sniper rifle. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his watch. Sierra 1 to command, the figure said, his voice carrying over the wind. Charges primed. Extraction ETA 2 minutes. The asset is contained. He turned. The red light of his night vision goggles locked onto me. I raised my weapon, but my hands were shaking from the cold. The timer in my head was ticking down. 6 minutes. Maybe less. The resort groaned beneath us, a deep, tectonic rumble as the geothermal pressure built up against the charges. Protocol Black is in effect, the sniper said, drawing a combat knife as he slung his rifle. He knew I was out of ammo, or close to it. He wanted to do this quietly. No witnesses. I ejected the empty magazine and let it clatter on the frozen roof. I didn't reload. Instead, I pulled the flare gun I had taken from the emergency kit in the boiler room. It was a desperate gamble, a single shot. No witnesses, I repeated, and pulled the trigger. The flare hissed out, not at him, but into the accumulation of snow on the overhang directly above the tower. A small, calculated avalanche. Chapter 10 was going to be a hell of a descent. The breech charge detonated with a dull, concussive thud that I felt in my molars more than I heard. The sound dampened by the reinforced titanium alloy of the safe room door. Dust and pulverized drywall ghosted down from the ceiling, coating the sleek, obsidian surfaces of the server terminal in a fine gray powder. My tactical display flickered, the battery icon flashing a critical red. I had 12% power left on the optics and 7 rounds in the magazine of the scavenged MP5. Beyond that 3-inch steel barrier, the cleanup crew, call sign Viper, was drilling. I could hear the high-pitched whine of a diamond-tipped thermal lance eating through the locking mechanism. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to erase. I checked the upload progress bar on the center monitor. 94%. The cursor blinked with agonizing slowness, a digital heartbeat measuring the remaining seconds of my life. I adjusted the tourniquet on my left thigh, wincing as the windlass bit into the torn quadricep. The pain was sharp, grounding, a necessary reminder that I was still biological, still distinct from the cold machinery surrounding me. I shifted my weight, bringing the submachine gun up to a low ready, bracing the stock against my shoulder. The room, the sanctum as the blueprints called it, was the nervous system of the entire resort. It was here that I finally understood what this place was. It wasn't a hotel. It was a conditioning chamber. I glanced at the scrolling data streams on the secondary monitors. Protocol Black wasn't a virus or a biological agent, as I had feared in the upper atrium. It was sound. Infrasound. The architectural geometry of the resort, the specific curvature of the spa walls. The hollow spaces beneath the floorboards in the luxury suites. They were all designed to act as massive Helmholtz resonators. The resort was a musical instrument played at a frequency below the threshold of human hearing, specifically 18.98 Hz. The ghost frequency. At high enough amplitudes, it didn't just cause unease. It resonated with the fluid in the human eye to induce hallucinations, and worse. It vibrated the cranial cavity to disrupt the amygdala. The elites who came here weren't getting therapy. They were being reprogrammed. Their paranoia was amplified, their decision-making centers rewired to suit the investors' needs. And now, I had the schematics. The thermal lance punched through. A spark of molten metal spat onto the carpet, smelling of ozone and burning synthetic wool. I didn't wait. I couldn't win a firefight in a fatal funnel against armored Tier 1 operators. I had to change the environment. I reached into my webbing and pulled out the improvised explosive device I'd cobbled together from the kitchen cleaning supplies and a road flare. A crude info charge inside a pressure cooker. It wouldn't kill them all, but it would buy me the chaos I needed. 98%, I whispered, my throat raw. The door groaned, the locking bolts retracting with a hydraulic hiss. A flash bang rolled into the room, clattering across the floor. I squeezed my eyes shut and clamped my hands over my ears, counting the heartbeat. 1. 2. Asterisk bang. Asterisk. The overpressure wave washed over me, but the blindness was temporary. I snapped my eyes open, seeing the blurred silhouettes of 3 figures stacking up in the doorway through the tear gas haze. I triggered the detonator on the pressure cooker sitting on the reception desk. The explosion was deafening, a jagged roar that shredded the expensive mahogany and sent shrapnel singing through the air. The lead operator crumpled, his armor plate insufficient against the concussive force at point-blank range. The other 2 staggered back, their formation broken. I moved. Not away from them, but toward the side maintenance hatch I'd unlocked minutes ago. I grabbed the hard drive, ripping it from the terminal just as the upload complete notification flashed green. I rolled over the sleek conference table, glass shattering under my boots, and fired 2 suppression bursts toward the door. The rounds sparked harmlessly off the doorframe, but they kept the remaining Vipers' heads down. I hit the release on the maintenance hatch, a heavy iron wheel that turned with a rusted screech, and shoved myself into the darkness of the cable run. Gravity took over. I slid down the 45-degree concrete chute, the rough surface tearing at my fatigue pants. This was the cooling intake, pulling freezing alpine air from the mountainside to chill the massive server banks. It was a one-way trip to the outside. I tumbled out onto a grate, the wind howling like a banshee, instantly freezing the sweat on my face. I was outside, suspended on a service catwalk clinging to the sheer cliff face, 4,000 meters up in the Italian Alps. The storm was at its peak. Visibility was 0. A complete whiteout. The resort loomed above me, a jagged shadow in the swirling snow, looking less like a building and more like a fortress of solitude. I scrambled to my feet, the hard drive cold and heavy against my chest. I had to make it to the funicular station, 2 clicks east along the ridge. A bullet cracked the air inches from my ear, followed a second later by the report of a suppressed rifle. They had thermal optics. They could see my heat signature burning through the storm. I vaulted over the railing, dropping 10 feet onto a snow-covered ledge, landing in powder up to my waist. I scrambled, fighting the snow, fighting the exhaustion. Every breath was razor blades in my lungs. I didn't look back. I knew they were coming. They were professionals. They wouldn't stop until the data was recovered or I was dead. I moved erratically, using the jagged rocks as cover, trying to break the line of sight. The cold was seeping into my bones, slowing my reactions. My fingers were numb inside my gloves. I checked my GPS. The funicular maintenance shed was 500 meters away. If I could hotwire the emergency descent cart, I could outrun them. If not, I froze here. I reached the shed 10 minutes later, my body shivering violently. The door was frozen shut. I used the stock of the MP5 as a hammer, shattering the ice around the latch. I stumbled inside, the air smelling of grease and stale diesel. The emergency cart was there, a yellow metal cage on rusted wheels. I jammed the control panel open with my knife. Red wire. Black wire. Spark. The electric motor groaned, then whirred to life. I jumped into the cage just as the door to the shed blew inward. A figure stood there, clad in Arctic camouflage, a rifle raised. I slammed the release lever. The cart jerked forward, dropping out of the shed and onto the steep track plunging down the mountain. Bullets sparked against the metal cage, but gravity was my ally now. The cart accelerated, screaming down the rails, faster and faster, descending into the white void. I huddled on the floor of the cage, clutching the drive. The wind roared through the mesh, deafening, violent. I looked back up toward the peak. The resort was gone, swallowed by the storm. But as the distance grew, I felt a strange sensation, a pressure lifting from my skull. The hum, that low-frequency vibration I hadn't realized was there until it was gone, faded away. My mind felt clearer, sharper than it had in days. Protocol Black. I had the proof. I had the names of the senators, the CEOs, the royals who had visited, who had been tuned by the architecture. The cart shuddered, hitting a drift on the tracks, threatening to derail, but it held. I watched the altimeter on my watch drop. 3,000 meters. 2,000 meters. The snow turned to sleet, then to rain. Below me, the lights of the valley village twinkled like distant stars, oblivious, safe, silent. I leaned back against the cold metal mesh, the adrenaline crashing, leaving me empty. I pulled the drive out and looked at it. A small, black rectangle containing the blueprint for mass psychological control. I laughed, a dry, cracking sound. I had survived the resort. I had survived the vipers. But as the cart slowed, approaching the valley station, a new thought chilled me more than the alpine wind. I had spent 7 days in that resort. 7 days sleeping in those rooms, walking those halls, listening to that silence. I touched my temple. The hum was gone, yes. But was my mind my own? Or had the protocol already done its work? Was my escape part of the programming? Was I the carrier, bringing the frequency down to the world below? The cart clattered to a halt at the bottom station. Silence returned. I stepped out into the rain, the hard drive gripped tight in my hand, and walked into the darkness. Looking over my shoulder at the mountains one last time. The nightmare wasn't up there anymore. It was coming with me.